Unit 5B, the Russian Revolution. The roots of the Russian Revolution of 1917 were deep. Russia had suffered under an extremely oppressive form of government for centuries under the rule of czars, which would be their rulers. So what does oppressive mean? So, don't know if you knew this, but if you hit the ALT button and click on a word, you can get the definition. So oppressive means unjustly inflicting hardship and constrainment, especially on a minority group. An oppressive dictator is the example. And some synonyms would be harsh, cruel, brutal. I would just put really mean, kind of mean for no reason, unfair, unjust. So those would be some definitions that you guys could use for your oppressive question. The next box says, during the 19th century, the country was filled with movements for political liberalization. Russia usually had multiple uprisings over many years. The first one took place in 1825. Like many that followed, was not fully successful. However, it did help set the stage for future generations of dissidents. And so what do you think the future generations are referencing? And I think it's the idea that there's going to be multiple uprisings, that when change needs to happen, they're going to keep fighting for it. In 1861, the Russian Empire finally abolished serfdom. The emancipation of serfs would influence the events leading up to the Russian Revolution by giving peasants more freedom to organize. So we're going to stop and think, was it a good idea for the Russian government to free serfs? I'm hoping you say yes, because serfs were those people who were paid very little to do very hard jobs. So setting them free is going to give more people freedom and opportunity to move up and down in the economy and in the government. In the early 1900s, Russia was one of the most impoverished countries in Europe, with an enormous peasant population and a growing minority of poor industrial workers. Russia industrialized much later than Western Europe and the United States. When it finally did, around the turn of the 20th century, it brought with it immense social and political changes. By 1905, shortly after another uprising, it appeared that the ruler of Russia, Tsar Nicholas II, was looking at establishing a constitutional monarchy. Such a change, however, would not have satisfied either the Tsar or his opponents. Radical revolutionaries continued to fight for a democratic republic, and the Tsar wanted to retain his control of the peasants. So nothing was really accomplished, once again, other than further resentment from both sides against the other. So we're going to stop and pause. Why would becoming a constitutional monarchy not be appealing to the Tsar Nicholas II? And it would not be appealing because a constitutional monarchy means you still have a king or a ruler, but they have to follow rules like everyone else. They have to be held to a certain standard. And there's oftentimes a group like Parliament that would help them make decisions. In the fall of 1915, as World War I raged, Tsar Nicholas had taken command of the Russian armies in the field. This left a power vacuum in the capital. The collapse of the government suddenly came in March 1917. Food riots, strikes, and war protests turned into mass demonstrations. The army refused to fire on the demonstrators. A Soviet of workers and soldiers, deputies, were elected, and it formed what they called a provisional government on March 14th. So right when the government was at its weakest and things were falling apart, they made this transition government that was going to help take over. The next day, Nicholas abdicated, which means he gave up his throne, and him and his family were taken into custody and confined. Eventually, the leaders of the revolution believed that people loyal to the Tsar would try to free him and his family. It was the reason that Tsar Nicholas and his family would later be executed. The leaders of the provisional or transitional government established a liberal program of rights such as freedom of speech, equality before the law, the right of unions to organize and strike. They opposed violent social revolution. So, what is a provisional government? It's a transition. So, they're not saying that's the government they wanted necessarily, but it's the government that was going to take the place of the government that was not working for them. So, it's a transition, it's an in between. And then this question says, was Russia any different under the provisional government? Why or why not? And I think if you look up here, they were a liberal program and they gave things like freedom of speech, equality. They worked on putting people not above the law, but making them follow the law, the right to unions to organize and different things. That's going to give workers a lot of rights. And they still were against the violent social revolution. So they thought you could stand up for your rights, but never bring violence into it. Now we get into the provisional government. So that transition government was a combination of groups representing various points of view. Some leaders wanted to withdraw from the war, so get out of World War I, and have immediate economic reform, so change the way the economy was working, with guarantees of political liberty. So they wanted to try to make politics more fair and bring about some more social change. Others wanted to continue the war and postpone all reforms until the conflict was finished. No compromise seemed workable. Into this government turmoil came Vladimir Lenin. And some of you have heard about Lenin. So Lenin had been living in exile for his beliefs. These beliefs followed the ideas of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Lenin was the leader of the radical group known as the Bolsheviks. They believed it was necessary to use force to bring about an ideal society run by workers and peasants. Lenin's slogan was, "All power to the Soviets." He used his slogan to undermine the provisional government. He demanded peace at once, immediate land reform for workers, and control over the factory and self-determination for the non-Russian people. Lenin rallied people to his beliefs by promising peace, so to get out of the war or make peace with the Allies and the Central Powers. He wanted to benefit Russia in that way. Land reforms, which meant he wanted to give land to the workers, and then bread, because there was such a disparity, a big difference between the rich and the poor. Many poor people were working hard in these factories producing food that they couldn't afford to buy themselves. So what does that mean? Peace at once. He wanted workers to be able to own land and, in theory, be able to buy food, to keep bread. And then we get down on November 6th and 7th, 1917, or October 24th and 25th in the Julian calendar, which is why the event is often referred to as the October Revolution. Leftist revolutionaries led by the Bolshevik Party, which had Lenin as their leader, launched a nearly bloodless coup d'etat against the provisional government. So if you remember from the Napoleon unit, a coup d'etat is when you swiftly kind of come in and just take control over the government. There's not necessarily a war, there's no voting. You just kind of come in and you're going to make the decisions that need to be made, or at least that you feel need to be made. So it's that swift transition where you just take control. The provisional government had been assembled by a group of leaders from Russia's bourgeoisie capitalist class. Lenin instead called for a Soviet government that would be ruled directly by councils of soldiers, peasants, and workers. So this is that divide between the social classes. So who did Lenin think should control? He thought it should be directly controlled by a council or a group of soldiers, peasants, and workers. So he wanted to give power to the people, in theory. Before, under that provisional government, remember the bourgeoisie is that upper class, so the upper capitalist group had controlled Russia prior to this time. The Bolsheviks and their allies occupied government buildings and other strategic locations in Petrograd and formed a new government with Lenin as its head. Lenin became the dictator of the world's first communist state. So what did Lenin become? He is the first dictator of the world's first communist state. He's not the world's first dictator. He's the first dictator of the world's first communist state. Sorry. And I think this map is really interesting because you can see here's the Bolshevik territory. You can see the territories that they eventually win and then lose at later times. You can see all those red stars are Bolshevik uprisings or major civil wars. So that means you have people within the same country fighting each other. And then you look at just how mighty and big Russia's territory is. So this is the area we are referring to right now. We will talk more about Russia when we talk about World War I.